Welcome to a sauerkraut making demonstration for the Community Resource Center of Killaloe from the Seniors Active Living Center garden that's behind the Killaloe Friendship Center. I today am going to show you how I make sauerkraut out of cabbages that we grew and carrots that we grew in that garden this summer, which is in 2020. This is November, so I harvested cabbages a couple of weeks ago in October, and I've laid out some things that you would need if you were to make sauerkraut. You will need cabbages, and here's the ones that need cleaning up. Here's the ones that I've started cleaning. You could have carrots. You don't have to have carrots. You could have turnips. My favorite recipe includes yummy and healthy ginger root, grated, that goes in, and turmeric root, super healthy, boosts your immune system. Or you could have juniper berries is another thing that people put in sauerkraut, or caraway seeds, or you could just have it plain, cabbage and salt. Those are the two ingredients for sauerkraut making, the main ones. Here I've brought some sauerkraut that I made before, 4 weeks ago, and maybe I can show it to you more closely. This is, you can see, if you look closely, there's some liquid in here, and you can see different colors. The liquid is because when you mix sauerkraut with the chopped cabbage with salt, it brings out the juices, and then those juices ferment, and that is a good fermentation, and it's what causes it to keep. So this sauerkraut making is something that used to be done in Europe, in Canada, all over the world. It's a fermentation of vegetables in general, is something that helps you preserve your vegetables over the winter. So you still have raw food you can eat, raw vegetables you can eat in the winter if you don't have a refrigerator, don't have electricity, have solar power, and so you have a limited cool storage space. There's a lot of good reasons in that regard to make sauerkraut out of your cabbages, but also because the fermented vegetables have in them really healthy microorganisms that are fantastic for your health. They boost your immune system, they help your digestion, they even make you happy. And they taste good, and all you need is a spoonful a day, maybe with your meal, a spoonful with each 2 of your meals a day or something like that, to get lots of good benefits. I find it helps digestion a lot. And it helps flavor and salt things that you add it to, because it has salt in it. So the other things you need are, you need a bowl so that you can chop up the vegetables and chop the cabbages and grate the carrots and these other roots and put them in here. And then you need salt. I've got Celtic sea salt here, Brittany Celtic sea salt, but you can use any salt, but you shouldn't be using anything that has iodine in it, so not regular table salt. It's got to be salt that's just kind of coarse pickling salt works, or this fancy sea salt. You need either a big jar or smaller jar, or a crock, which I didn't bring today, but a crockery crock is the usual way to do larger amounts. If you have a crock, you'll need a plate and then something to use as a weight, like a clean stone, heavy stone, or a bag of water, or a jar of water, or a jar of sand, something heavy to push the plate down on top so that you're pushing down the cabbage and the juices rise up a little bit above it. And that way nothing like mold from the air can get into the kraut, because all of the kraut is under the liquid, and that means you only get the good kinds of microorganisms in to make a delicious and good kraut that doesn't have any bad parts. You also need a knife. I've got a good cleaver for the bigger parts of the chopping, and a smaller knife for the smaller vegetables. This is a kind of a special knife. It's ceramic. It's a ceramic knife. It looks kind of like plastic. It looks like it's not sharp, but be careful because it is. It's slightly more breakable than metal ones, but it keeps its sharpness longer, so that's one reason to have one of these. You need graters, and so I'm going to grate the carrots with this one, and I'm going to grate the ginger with this one, smaller. And if I had turnips, I could grate them on either one. You need a pestle, which is to press the cabbage down after you've chopped it and after you've mixed in some salt. Press it down into your jar or into your crock. Some people say it's really good to do a whole lot of pounding to bruise the cabbage, and other people say just press it and don't even bruise it. So I like that idea because it's less work, and it seems to work fine for us. And then you also could have instead, or as well, this smaller size pestle, and that's good for pressing your kraut into a jar, pressing it down. You want to press it so that you're pressing the salt into the cabbage so that the juices flow out, and then the juices help it ferment, and they help it be not exposed to the air when you press something on it, or just when you press it down. And smaller bowls to grate smaller vegetables into. That's another thing. And a cutting board, obviously, and a measuring spoon for your salt. And ideally you would also have a weighing scale, because if you have a fantastic recipe, then it will tell you something like 5 pounds of cabbage needs 3 tablespoons of salt. So I'm just going to wing it because I've done it a lot of times, and I will estimate how many pounds, since I forgot my weighing scale, my kitchen weighing scale. But this is for measuring our salt. And that's probably all we need to say at the moment, and I can start actually making some sauerkraut. So you start with your cabbages. Some of them, if you did harvest them out of the garden and not buying them from the store, and they sat around for a couple of weeks like these did, they're going to need some cleaning up. So you want to peel off the outer leaves and put them into your compost, or save the good parts and feed them to your rabbits or cows or horses. It's really good to have that cycle of nature going. Compost means you get good soil, and then you can grow more cabbages and other vegetables. And then animals, if you feed it to animals, they end up giving you manure, so it cycles back into your food system. Or you can just enjoy the joy that they have in eating something good. So I'm peeling off the worst of the leaves and then just carving out the little extra bad spots that are here, and chopping off the stem, putting it in the compost. So then you want to chop it really finely. You can also chop chunks and use a food processor. That's a really fast, easy way that's not as strenuous. But you end up having a less textured sauerkraut if you use a food processor. And that can be a good thing, especially if you have problems with your teeth. It's nice, soft, and easy to chew then. But if you really like texture, then you can do it this way, and if you have the ability to chop it up. So you always cut out the core, because it's pretty tough and strong tasting, very cabbagey tasting. So there's the core, that part there that I'm cutting off at an angle here. Let me get this out of the way so we'll only be using the leafy part. And then I'll be collecting up cabbage in our big bowl. So I usually slice really thinly, or I use at home, we have a handmade in Europe, in Germany. We have a special wooden slicer with a knife that you can take if you're doing large amounts of sauerkraut. You take your whole head of cabbage and you set up your big wooden slicer, cabbage slicer, and then maybe you have a wall here and your body is holding the other end of this big slicer that's made out of wood, plus a blade here, and you just put this in the little wooden cradle and you press down and you press forward over the knife over and over and over again, and it slices very thinly the cabbage, and the cabbage slices drop into your bowl or into your crock even. It's a pretty cool method if you're doing larger amounts, and I like doing that too. And I also love doing these small ones because you can just quickly do a jar or two's worth when you do it by hand. So I'm doing this, I'm aiming for less than 1/4 inch wide, thin slices. I guess there you can see it better there. And then turn it around and chop it the other way so that you have closer to smaller bits. You have a lot more smaller bits. The sooner you make kraut after you harvest it, the better, because it's got more of its own natural juices in it, and then it makes kraut more easily because you need those cabbage juices in there to make that whole fermentation process work well. If you end up having some dry cabbages that are quite dry, you can add salt water instead of just salt. That's something I've done. But the juices themselves from the cabbage are the best, fresh. So families, pioneer families, I've read about pioneer families talking about making a giant crock, or a giant, even a wooden barrel, sometimes they make it in a wooden barrel, of sauerkraut, and they would just chip away at it, or, well, when I say chip away at it, that's because in the wooden barrel, they would fill their barrel with salt, and with cabbage and salt, and pound it a bit before they put it in the giant wooden barrel, and then they'd have a lid that seals, and they'd turn it on its side, and they'd roll it out into the shed and let it freeze for the winter. Stand it up again. And then they would, every day or every few days, they would go out there, take off the lid, and use an ice pick to chip away at the frozen sauerkraut after it's been fermented. It needs warmth to ferment first. And bring it in the house and thaw it out and eat it. It just sounded like an amazing method. I had just recently heard about that. That used to happen. And probably still does happen. People all over the world have been making fermented food for hundreds of years. It's a really great way to make use of Mother Nature's bounty and have your beautiful homegrown or locally grown food, fresh, raw food available to you in the winter months if you live in a part of the world where there are winter months. Cold winter months, I mean. Cold winter months. When you can't grow your own food during that time. So I'll get some carrots going to add to this. And we had some purple cabbage as well as green cabbage in the garden this year. Now I haven't explained yet this very interesting lid for this jar, for the jar. This is one of the many ways you can do sauerkraut. You can actually put an airlock on it. So this airlock is the biggest bung size that you can get for an airlock. Usually airlocks are for making wine, beer, alcoholic hard cider from your apple juice, raw, freshly pressed juice, grape juice. But this size fits your regular standard regular mouth canning jar, and so it's useful for sauerkraut. And what it does is it allows the bubbling up that happens with fermentation to come out. The gases come out, but no air from the outside air gets in, because it has a special little part in the middle that you fill with water. Take off this lid and this lid, and you fill up to a little line that says fill line. And you put the water around the sides here, and then you put this little lid on top again after you've put in half full with water. Then you put this one on too, and it has little holes in it which allow the gases to escape. But the whole water process doesn't allow any air to get back in. And then you put this as rubber, so it seals on here, so air doesn't get past here either. And then that means that no mold spores in the air can get in. And it's an easy way, without having to use a weight and a plate, to make a small amount of kraut. So I was excited to discover that, and I've been doing that as well as this other larger method, and as well as the crock method. All work well. You can also put beets. I like to put red beets with purple cabbage because they're pretty colored, matched together. Beets, turnips, daikon radish, and that's making the regular German European sauerkraut, where you would use these things. Also, you can use Chinese cabbage, Napa cabbage, and make something else, an Asian kind of sauerkraut called kimchi. And that is that usually has hot spicy peppers, pepper sauce, and lots of garlic and lots of ginger. And that's a whole other thing. And since that kind of cabbage is very soft, the whole process goes more quickly. It's cabbage, regular cabbage sauerkraut can take between 3 weeks and 6 months, depending on, you just test it. You test it every couple of weeks to see whether you like the taste, because it gets more sour over time, and whether you like the texture, because it gets softer over time. I like it kind of young, which would be 3 or 4 or 6 weeks. And my husband and son like it better 6 months. So it's good lots of ways. Normally we would just keep it at room temperature, but you can slow down the process by putting it in a cooler corner of the house, and then it'll go much more slowly. And then if you aren't in a hurry, that's fine. And also, it's good to make it in the fall when the weather's not too hot, because if it was really hot, it goes actually a little too quickly, and it maybe gets more sour than you would like it too soon. So it's good to plant your cabbages in the spring, and they usually harvest in the fall, and then it's just the right timing. And if you were making kimchi, that would be that has a shorter growing season. And if you plant garlic in the fall, and then you harvest your garlic at the beginning of August, then that bed is ready to plant Napa cabbage. And Napa cabbage likes to grow a short season, and it likes the cold. So it likes the cold weather that comes in September, October. So if you plant it at the beginning of August, it will be ripe and ready by the end of October. And then you can make your, just in the nice cold season, you can make your kimchi. So now we've got some carrots to add to this. And next, not too many people would be doing what I'm doing with my sauerkraut. It's pretty unusual to add in, well, ginger maybe isn't that unusual, but turmeric I think is fairly unusual. And I also like adding in dandelion root, chopped burdock root. Those are all so healthy and they add nice flavor. And might as well make my food be my medicine. Those things are things that you would normally think of as herbs that you would make a tea out of. But you can also put it in your food. So ginger, I just love the flavor, but it's also very medicinal, famous for being just an all-around good food to eat. Add to your food. So it's good to have it finely grated. These are all organic ginger root and organic turmeric root, and if it wasn't, I might have peeled it first. And then the last little bit I might chop up finely because it's pretty hard. We don't want to be hurting our fingers while we're trying to grate the little roots. Well, this could be done in a food processor, just chop everything up together, but I think with ginger, little things like this, you probably would get some big chunks that you'd rather not have. So I think grating with the hand grater for the ginger is probably best. Okay, so mixing that in. Mixing in the ginger into the bowl of cabbage and carrot. So I learned sauerkraut making from Sandor Katz, who wrote this book called Wild Fermentation. And he really believes in just using your hands to mix in the salt and mix all the vegetables together and squish it so that it gets the juices flowing. And he's an expert and seems to have had tons of success with making sauerkraut. So here's his book, Wild Fermentation. Well, he has other books too, but this is one of his books, Wild Fermentation. And on page 41 is the basic cabbage sauerkraut recipe that I usually use. And he says 1 to 4 weeks or more is how the time frame for making these things, this sauerkraut. So then you can either chop or grate your turmeric root as well if you want to choose to put that in. Turmeric root is quite famous for helping your immune system. And I love the flavor and the color, the beautiful orange color of a turmeric root. It does stain my knife and my cutting board. But since I like to eat turmeric frequently, as often as possible, I just have to put up with that. So I usually cut it lengthwise in quarters and then slice it. Now we've got one whole cabbage chopped up in here. We've got a carrot in here and some ginger root, some turmeric root, and we're ready to put in our salt. And normally, as Sandor Katz said, we have maybe 5 pounds of cabbage will equal needing about 3 tablespoons of salt. I think we've got maybe 2 or 3 pounds, 3 pounds of cabbage probably in here. So I'm going to put in 2 tablespoons of salt. And you can also salt it to taste later. I've got all my different vegetables in here. And then Sandor recommends, and this is how I do it, just mix it all together with your hands. The good bacteria and the lack of air means that, clean washed hands, but with no residue of salt or sanitizer on them, are just fine in your sauerkraut, because the microbiology only allows, when it's under the liquid, it only allows in the good bacteria and doesn't allow any bad bacteria. So I'm now mixing the salt, the vegetables, the ginger root and turmeric root, and if I had in that purple cabbage, I might have added beets as well, or I might have added turnip. Get it well mixed, so the salt is all mixed in there too. And then squeeze. You want to start squeezing it because that makes it release its juices, because the salt is trying to suck the water out of the cabbage. So you just take fistfuls and squeeze. And then, once you've done that a bit, you can start actually doing a bit of pressing or pounding with your pestle. Now I'm going to take it off of its special graters. Okay, now we've done some pounding, and this cabbage is starting to look wetter because the juices are starting to come out of the cabbage from the pounding and the salt. You can see how it's shiny, it's getting a little wet. This is you can pound it for longer, or you can put it through a food processor, or you can just now spoon it into your jars, or your big jar, or your crock. I'm just going to do a small jar with this handy dandy airlock with the largest size bung. Number 13, that's the one to get. Number 13, the largest size you can get, these rubber bungs. And you buy them at a beer making supply store. I got this in mail order from Canadian Brewing Company, I think it's called, in Toronto. Had to mail order it. The shipping was kind of expensive, so it ended up being like $10 each. So I don't have very many, and I just reuse them over time, and I'm happy that it makes the sauerkraut making a little simpler. So now I'm going to show you the kraut as I spoon it in. So you need a ladle, a funnel. You need a funnel. This is something I forgot to tell you at the beginning, so that you can easily spoon your kraut into your jar. Now, a lot of people used to use kraut in the pioneer days as a vegetable, and still do, that they would cook. They would use it both ways, mix it into some kind of a salad, or actually cook it with mashed potatoes and pork. Maybe fry it up with pork fat. Different things like that. And I've always had it raw because I know how beneficial the enzymes are for you. But if you have a lot, it's kind of nice to have that variety of a cooked vegetable too in the winter. It has a nice flavor. to spice up your winter, raw or cooked. So now I filled it, but it's quite loosely filled. And there's a lot of air spaces in there. So the next thing I do is get my little pestle and press it down in here gently, because you don't want to be breaking the glass. But this ceramic, I think it's called ceramic pottery, pestle works really well. I'm pressing it down, and as I press, some juices start to show up at the bottom. There's a slight amount of light orange juice because of the carrot making it orange. It's starting to show up as I press. And eventually, if you let it sit overnight, or if you had pounded it longer, you would have so many juices just from the action of the salt that it will come right up above the level of the cabbage. And that's what you're aiming for. You can also let your chopped cabbage with salt sit overnight just in the bowl with a cover over it. I've done that too before putting it in the jars, and that gives it time to pull those juices out. So what I often do is only fill this size jar. Oh yes, already the juices are coming up this far. So you keep pressing, you get those juices coming up. I usually fill this maybe 2/3 full or less, a little over half full, because what I found is a nice fresh homegrown cabbage is so actively full of those microorganisms, the fermentation creatures, that it really bubbles up and it expands. It just bubbles right up, and then it kind of tries to overflow inside the bung here, which is supposed to not let the gases out, but it will let the liquid out if the liquid is fermenting so much. The same thing happens with when you're making alcohol out of your own apple juice or pear juice or grape juice. You have to leave some airspace at the beginning because it's so active. All these natural yeasts and bacterias, the good ones, are fermenting, and they're causing a lot of bubbling. And then it can rise right up into the water part of your little airlock, and then you're not getting that, you can end up not having a good seal against air coming in and preventing your molds and bacteria that you don't want getting in. So I have learned to start out for the first week or two just having it be a smaller amount, not full jar. 2/3 or a little over half. That's measure. You fill it up all the way but loosely, and then you press it down and it becomes about a half, and then you fill it up a little more, and then it's about 2/3 after you press it down. And that seems to be the right amount, because if you go any higher, you'll have it overflowing from all that fermentation that happens. And then later, after 3 weeks, if you want it to keep on fermenting, you can then take your 2 jars that are half full and put them into 1 jar, because it's not as active after that. Because you can easily take off this airlock anytime to do that transfer from one jar to the other. So right now this is like a salty coleslaw. It's very crunchy, and this one, these 2 jars that are 3 or 4 weeks fermented are much softer to chew, but they're still a bit crunchy. That's kind of my favorite age But really it's nice to have variety. I do like the ones that are a few months as well. They have their own different texture, softer and more sour flavor. So this is the point where you would say, okay, that's a little over half full. That's probably just the right amount. In one jar, one liter jar. And now I'm going to put some water in the airlock before I stick that on, and also label what I've got here, because you always, it's very helpful if you label everything you do in terms of medicine making, food making, because then you can say, oh, this has been 3 weeks, or this has been 1 week, and then you can keep track. And if you say everything you put in it, if you didn't like something or you thought it was too much salt, next time you would do it differently, it's very helpful to label. The date, what exactly you put in there, any other details, like I'll often say where the cabbage and carrots came from. In this case it was from the garden behind the Killaloe Senior Friendship Center, which is a fabulous little happening place. So now this has been pressed and it just has had a little bit of time, and you can maybe see how much liquid there is in there. It's like it's filled up just about to here with liquid, and overnight or just in the next hour it'll probably get more juicy, especially if I press it down. You can start to see a couple of bubbles. It starts to ferment fairly quickly, and it bubbles up, and there's a few bubbles there I can see. And then over the next couple of days it's going to be quite bubbly, and then might get frothy up here, and it'll push all the cabbage up too. So preparing your airlock to put on top of your jar of sauerkraut, you need to take off this lid, which has holes in it that allows the gases to escape. Take that lid off. There's all the little holes in the top. And then pour out this part, which goes on top, and then this part has 2 lines in the middle there, and in between those 2 lines it says fill line. So you can obviously fill it with water up until somewhere in between those 2 lines. So I've got my handy dandy little cup of water here, very carefully pouring it, because you don't want to pour it through the hole in the middle, because the hole in the middle will fall right down through the hole in the middle of the bung, which would mean you would lose that water. So now it's filled up to the middle of the fill lines, the 2 fill lines. You can put this now on top of the inner tube, inner clear plastic tube. Drop it in there, put this lid on the top, snaps on. Now any gases that come up have to go through this. They go up and then they go down around the outside of the inner tube, and they come out in this water, and then they go up out of these little holes. But because of the water, nothing can go down in. So now you can just, it's all ready to press onto your jar, and you can sit it in a room temperature place in your kitchen, or a cooler place if you want this process to go more slowly. I always cover it with a towel to stop too much light or too much sunlight, especially. Partly because I don't want it to get hot and really quickly ferment, and even this might be too small of an air space if it was too hot. And partly because you lose some vitamins with light. So certain vitamins are reduced by having light, so it's nice to cover it with a nice clean towel and check it every couple of days. Look at it for the first few days to see how much it's bubbling up. Make sure it's not bubbling too much, in which case you would take some out and put it into another one that had less. Or just take some out and eat it. It's delicious at every stage. If you're worried about having any of the non-desirable microorganisms get in, the main key is, as long as your liquid is covering the solids in here, only the good ones can grow in here. If you are using a crock or a jar with a upside down plate and a weight on, then you may eventually, sometimes this happens to me, get some mold forming on top. In which case I'll check every couple of days, I'll spoon off the mold into my compost, and then I'll wipe with a vinegar soaked cloth the inside of the glass up down to that point. And then when I eventually take it out and put it into jars to refrigerate for eating later, at that point I'll take the top ½ inch or so that's maybe discolored and compost that, because everything below that that's a beautiful color will also taste good and will be totally safe because it has been under the liquid. So that's what you do when you've come to the point where you love the taste and the texture. 3 weeks or 6 weeks or 3 months later, you take off your bung, you put on a lid, the lid that fits this. I happen to save mayonnaise jar lids, and then I can, because the metal lids will rust from the sourness of the sauerkraut. You put on your lid, you can fill them up, make sure that they're all filled to the top. Once they stop working so much and they're not fermenting as much, then they're safe to put fill to the top by transferring from the other jars. And then you keep it in a very cold place, like a refrigerator, or if you have a root cellar. Also, root cellars don't like metal lids, because that root cellar is damp, so it'll cause the lid to rust as well, and then it's hard to take off and it's not good. And then you can just eat it at your leisure whenever you're ready. Then you can keep it all winter in the fridge. Here's my tape that I'm going to label this with, so that I don't forget exactly what day we did this, what the ingredients were. So today is November 8, I think. November 8, 2020. And I used Celtic sea salt and CRC Garden cabbage and carrots, and I also put in organic ginger root and organic turmeric root, and that will help me know. I can say, well, I'm going to check it in 3 weeks, so then I'll be able to see, when did I start? Okay, organic turmeric and organic ginger. And then you can look back and say, I liked it with those ingredients, or maybe I should put something different in next time, less ginger or more ginger or something. So there it is, your label jar, ready to sit in the corner of your kitchen with a clean towel on it for a few weeks until you're ready to jar it up and put it in the fridge. Fantastically delicious. It has a pleasant sour smell, cabbagey sour smell. Very good for your health. I hope you have a successful and enjoyable sauerkraut making time yourself. Hooray for sauerkraut!